our last TAP conference in September, and it was a lot of people said it was their favorite presentation of the whole thing, of the whole conference. So we were delighted that he agreed to give the presentation again, and I think that you're going to find it really fascinating as much as the TAP staff did as well. So Dr. James Hung is relatively new to Oklahoma, but a long time somebody lover of native bees. I'll let him talk more about that in a minute, but he is at University of Oklahoma, and I'll let him take it from there. So thank you.
Right, thank you so much for having me, Jane, and the rest of Tribal Alliance for Pollinators. As Jane introduced, I'm only very freshly arrived in Oklahoma, but I have been working on native bees for the last decade or so, and I've really grown to love this group of amazing insects. And today I'm just going to share a little bit about how they live their lives and why it is that they need our help, and what are some of the things we can do to help their conservation. I'm going to be showing a lot of photos because I think a picture is worth 1,000 words. So in lieu of me spamming all my slides with copyrights attributed to myself, anytime you see a photo that does not have a copyright, it's either a photo that's freely available or a photo that I have taken myself. Right, I would like to start by acknowledging that the land on which the University of Oklahoma now resides was the traditional home of the Hasinai Caddo Nation and the Kirikiri, Wichita, and affiliated tribes. I acknowledge this territory once also served as a hunting ground, trade exchange point, and migration route for the Apache, the Comanche, Kiowa, and Osage nations. And the University of Oklahoma recognizes the historical connection that our university has with its indigenous community. And we also acknowledge, honor, and respect the diverse indigenous peoples connected to this land. We fully recognize, support, and advocate for the sovereign rights of all of Oklahoma's 39 tribal nations. So I'm going to start my talk about bees by talking about plants. So we all know that most plants grow from seeds, and in order to produce a fertile, viable seed, plants need to combine genetic material from a father and a mother, just like animals do. Now, one feature we all know about plants is that they are rooted in place and they can't move. So how do they go about exchanging genetic information with an individual that's located far away? Well, they need a system that includes a mobile component. And that mobile component is pollen, which is the male gametophyte of the plant, here shown at 500 times magnification. Pollen grains are produced by specialized structures in a plant's flower. That's called the anther. And the goal of life for pollen grains is to land on another flower's receptive structure and fertilize the egg cell that's present in that other flower, which then results in the development of a seed. So how does pollen get from one plant to another? Well, many plant species are pollinated by the wind, like our familiar lawn grasses, and in the middle we have corn. On the right-hand side, we have ragweed. So wind-pollinated plants is the reason that we get hay fever. And this just results from wind blowing these pollen grains into your eyes and your nose, and then your body freaks out at these unwanted advances from these plants as these pollen grains germinate into your sinuses. So as you can guess, dispensing pollen using the wind can be very inefficient and wasteful. So wind pollinated plants need to make lots and lots and lots of this stuff. So this is a photo where there's a layer of tree pollen on some poor dude's car windshield. So you can imagine that if all plants on Earth are wind pollinated, there's going to be so much pollen everywhere all the time. We're all going to be sneezing. So thankfully, most plant species are not wind pollinated. In fact, the majority of plant species, about 85% or so of the known plant species on Earth, depend on animals to some extent for their pollination. So exchanging genetic information for plants is literally about the birds and the bees, and the flies and beetles and butterflies and moths and bats. And what makes all of these diverse organisms great pollinators is a bunch of shared characteristics, despite them being very distantly related to one another. They have great mobility. you'll want a pollinator that can fly long distances. You know, it's probably not very useful to have a caterpillar or an earthworm as your pollinator. They have great sensory abilities that allow them to detect a species of flower in the landscape, and they have a reliance on flowers for food. Usually this is nectar and pollen, but some also eat petals. This last point, actually, the reliance of these pollinators on flowers for food illustrates the fact that pollination, this relationship of pollination between animals and plants, it's kind of more of like a mutual exploitation rather than this harmonious partnership that we're often taught. Because pollinators are always trying to get the most amount of food from the flowers while putting in the least amount of work. And on the other hand, plants are always trying to pay the least amount of pollen and nectar to hire these animals to pollinate them. But in general, the balance of these two sides tend to work out in this kind of free, unregulated market system. And as you can see, just by looking around, there's a tremendous amount of biodiversity that is sustained through these kind of selfish partnerships between plants and their pollinators. So in order to attract pollinators, plants have adapted these beautiful flowers that signal a tasty reward for their pollinators. So for animals like us, our reproductive organs are private parts, but for plants, they're the opposite. As you can imagine, different kinds of flowers are adapted for pollination by different kinds of pollinators. Many dissertations and books have been written on this topic, so I'm not going to go into greater detail about this. But instead, as advertised, I'm going to focus on bees, which are the most important pollinators in our region specifically, but also in many other parts of the world. So the first step to learning more about bees is learning how to recognize one. So bees, as you see in drawings, they are fuzzy creatures. In fact, the defining characteristic for taxonomists to recognize an insect as a bee is that they have branched hairs somewhere on their body. They have a thin waist, they have flattened hind legs, that often carry a thick brush of stiff bristles for collecting pollen. They have two pairs of wings that lie flat over their back, usually when they're foraging or at rest. They have thick elbowed antennae, and they have large but not bugged out eyes for the most part, because bees do need to see very well to target the flowers that they need to forage on in the environment. And they usually have some sort of striking dark and light pattern on their body. Now, since bees are classified by biologists as a group of very specialized vegetarian wasps, it makes sense that the insects that are most often confused for bees are other wasps. So because they're very closely related, wasps have similar antennae as bees, they have a similar thin waist, and they also often have contrasting bright and dark colors that warn potential predators that, you know, this guy is bad news. They carry a painful sting, stay away from them. But in non-bee wasps, the legs are not flattened because they don't need them to collect pollen. They often carry their wings held up at an angle and folded along the long axis, kind of like a hot dog bun. And they are usually a lot less hairy and don't have branched hairs. And if you see a bee or wasp looking like insect on a flower, but it's carrying some sort of insect prey, that's a dead giveaway that it's not a bee, because bees never hunt prey. Another insect that are sometimes confused for bees are bee mimicking flies. As you can imagine, bees are feared and respected by insect-eating predators that could be harmed by their self-defense stings. So a lot of organisms out there have adaptations that make them mimic bees. So you can tell that this insect is a fly because they have these huge bugged out eyes. They have short, stubby antennae. They have thin, wimpy legs that are usually not very hairy. And they only have one pair of wings instead of the two pairs that bees carry. And in the case of flies, they're usually not overlapping and held in a single plane on their back. Now, not all bees will display all the typical features of the bees that I showed you earlier, like these two bees. The one on the left is a alkali sweat bee. The one on the right is a member of the resin bee family. As you can see, if I see them in the field without really knowing exactly what they are, I would say, I don't know if that's a bee or a wasp. And there are also a lot of non-bee insects that, like the one I showed you earlier, do a very good job of imitating bees. Like this hoverfly I'm showing on the bottom that has overlapping wings over its back. You can't tell if it's got one pair or two pairs, and it's got these nice stripes on its abdomen. So please take my bee recognition 101 just now with a grain of salt, because it really takes a lot of training. Even a professional biologist will get it wrong unless they know exactly what the bees are in a particular region, because bees really are very highly diverse across the world. Speaking of bees being diverse, here are the faces of 16 native bees that I collected when I was a grad student back in California, just to give you a quick glimpse of the incredible variation and diversity that exists in the group of bees. We'll be spending the next few minutes on a brief overview of how different bee species live their lives. So as you can see, these faces all look different, and as form is often tied to function, you can imagine that these bees don't all live the same kind of lives. Before that, I'm gonna pause real quick and talk about this insect here, which is probably very familiar to you. It's the Western honeybee, and it's the insect that most people will conjure in their mind when someone says bee. As you know, they live in huge colonies, founded and headed by a single queen. Honeybee workers are incredibly hardworking all the time. Probably one of the most common causes of death for a honeybee worker is just exhaustion at the end of their lifespan. They store lots and lots of honey in their honeycombs, and they defend that resource very aggressively with their very painful stings. So I'm not going to talk too much about this species because it's not a native North American bee, but instead it's introduced from Europe by European settlers as kind of a livestock associated with their agricultural efforts. So now we see honeybees everywhere because people find them useful. They're important pollinators for our crops, and they have established thriving populations all over the place. So I'll return to honeybees a little bit later, but just wanted to mention that this next segment of the talk is not going to focus on the honeybee. So to start talking about native bees, I'd like to talk about what native bees are not. So 96% of native bees do not store up honey. 90% of native bees are not social, which means they don't live in these big family groups with a queen, but instead it's every bee for him or herself. More than half of the bees out there that you see cannot sting you, and about 1 in 8 species do not work hard and make an honest living. So maybe these stats are somewhat surprising to many of you. So if that's the case, then you're in for a treat as we learn about the lives of these native bees. So for the majority of native bee species, their life cycle goes like this. So a female bee will collect pollen and nectar from a flower, and when she gets enough, she deposits it in an underground nest that she excavates in the soil or sand. And then once she accumulates enough pollen and nectar, she makes kind of a doughish ball and lays an egg on it and seals that nest cell. And then she goes back and collects more until the end of her life. Meanwhile, the male bees are not doing very much other than flying around and chasing females. When the egg hatches in this underground chamber, the baby bee, which is called a larva, gets to live one of the cushiest lives of any baby animal out there. As you can see, this larva has no external feature. And again, as form is tied to function, you know that this baby bee really does not have any functions other than just, lie on this nutritious food pillow in this temperature controlled chamber and eat until it accumulates enough nutrients to progress its development. So after eating this giant food pillow, the bee larva metamorphosizes into a pupa. So bees go through complete metamorphosis just like butterflies do. And then the following year, usually, when the climate conditions are right, the bee emerges as an adult and the process starts all over again. So we were talking about just now how grown-up bees emerge when the time is right. What time is right depends on the species of bee that we're talking about. So many of our bees are what's known as pollen specialists, which means that they'll only provision their nest with pollen from one family or even one genus of plant. So in these cases, when the bee emerges, will have to be closely tied to the pluming period of the plant species that they're specialized on. So for example, this thistle longhorn bee will only collect pollen from thistle plants. So you'll only see it in the early summer months when thistle is blooming. And here's a keeled evening bee, which is a specialist on Helianthus sunflowers. So you'll only see it flying in the late summer and early fall when sunflowers are in bloom. Here's a turret bee that only collects pollen from cactus flowers. And so therefore it only flies in the spring when cactus is in bloom. So why is it called a turret bee? Well, that's because they build little turrets around their nest entrances, presumably as a defense against parasitic bee flies that will shoot eggs into their nest if the nests are not properly defended. So here's one. My good friend Jimbo took a great video of this bee fly shooting eggs into these undefended nests. Here you can see in the red circle the egg that the fly is flinging from the tip of her abdomen. Now, ground nesting specialist bees also includes one of the smallest bees out there. This is the Euphorb mini fairy bee, which only collects pollen from the sandmat plant. So if you know how small sandmat flowers are, you have a pretty good idea of this bee's size. If you don't know what size sandmat flowers are, here's good old Abe Lincoln for scale. And you can see that the bee is a little bit longer than 2 letters on a penny. Now, given the total dependence of our specialist bees on the host pollen, the pollen of their host plant, you would assume that these bees are going to be the best, most high fidelity pollinators for their special host, right? Well, that's not exactly right all the time. So what I'm showing here is a currant minor bee, which, as its name implies, it forages only for pollen on currant or ribes plants. This one here is foraging on fuchsia flowered currant from Southern California. And this plant has these long tubular flowers that are primarily pollinated by hummingbirds. So when this bee forages for pollen, it actually transfers very little pollen from the male parts to the female parts. So for the most part, it's actually just stealing pollen from this plant. So here's one concrete example where pollinators really are just out there for their own interests and really don't care what kind of service they're providing for the plant in return. Another assumption that people might make about pollen specialist bees is that they're not really relevant to the average person because they're only associated with a small subset of native plants out there. But however, some specialist bees can be incredibly economically important when they're associated with crop plants, like this squash bee here, Peponapis, that pollinates squashes and pumpkins. And actually research has shown that in places where there are large pumpkin fields and healthy populations of these bees can pollinate the entire field in the hour right before and right after the sun rises, well before any of the other pollinators are even awake and doing their work. Now, in addition to bees' diets being specialized, some bees also have specialized requirements for what kind of soil substrates that they nest in as well. So for example, there's this tiny croton fairy bee that only forages for pollen on croton, which is doveweed, and only nests in loose exposed sand. So even though croton is relatively widespread, doveweed that is, you'll only find this little bee where it can find the proper kind of sand to make its substrate nest. So these bees are kind of more prone to being disturbed when we change their environment. All right, so even though I showed you a lot of specialist bees just now, and indeed we have a lot of specialist bees here in North America and Oklahoma in particular, the majority of bees out there are actually pollen generalists, which means that they are able to and willing to forage for pollen from many different kinds of plant species and families. So here's one of the very abundant pollen generalists out there, the Texas striped sweat bee, Agapostemon texanus. It looks incredibly exotic with this, like metallic green glow, but actually it's one of our most common bee species and it's widespread throughout the United States. Okay, here's the last ground nesting bee I'm going to show you for now. It's a polyester bee or cellophane bee. Its name comes from the fact that it lines its nest with a waterproof secretion that's chemically and physically similar to cellophane, and then it deposits a soupy pollen nectar slurry, like a smoothie, instead of like a solid dough ball like I showed you earlier. And one interesting fact about this provision is that this slurry will start fermenting and bubbling and developing a yeasty smell. And scientists who were excavating bee nests to understand their biology more, when they excavated the nests of polyester bees and their relatives, they observed this phenomenon, and they hypothesized that bees may actually be deriving a lot of nutrients from the microbes and yeasts that colonize their pollen provisions. And more recently, more advanced analytical techniques have shown that that is indeed the case. So that means that the provisions that bees gather for their offspring isn't just raw pollen and nectar, but it's more kind of like a value-added product like kombucha or sauerkraut that has more nutrients than the ingredients would suggest, which also makes bees some of the earliest brewers. And it makes them a little bit closer to microbe eaters than strict vegetarians. Now, among the bees that don't excavate their own nests underground, most of them nest in the wood. Some bees, like carpenter bees, can carve their own tunnels in the wood, but most bees don't have this kind of horsepower, so they use existing cavities that were left behind by critters like beetles, or in the case of this picture here, holes drilled in the wood by human researchers who are studying bees. Now, since these bees don't construct their own homes, but rather rent pre-existing space, we say rent, and that's actually kind of the technical term that bee biologists use for species that don't construct their own nests. They do have to bring in their own furniture to make the place comfy and hospitable for their babies. So some species cut leaves and petals to protect their pollen balls. Others will use mud and resin. Some will even scrape little pieces of fuzz from plants and weave kind of a pillow cover material for depositing their pollen and containing their babies. So even though these bees don't have to labor to excavate their, these long tunnels in the sand or the soil, they do have to spend quite a bit of time scrounging around for materials that are used for building nests. Here's one of the wood tunnel nesters, a leafcutter bee. This bee and its relatives, which are resin bees, mason bees, and pebble bees, collect pollen using brushes on the underside of their abdomen rather than on their hind legs. So in the world of bees, it's the ladies that have hairier legs and hairier bellies. Here's another wood tunnel nester, a masked bee, Hilius, which is a member of the Polyester bee family that I showed you earlier. So you can see that it's not very hairy. It doesn't have a pollen brush anywhere on its body. And that's because it is unique among our bees in that they carry pollen grains by swallowing it, and then they spit it back out, back in their nest. And also because it nests in these narrow tunnels in the wood, it's kind of like very cylindrical and streamlined. It's a sleek bee, not like the round and fuzzy bees that we tend to think about. So if you saw this insect and you identify it as a wasp, nobody would blame you. And it goes to show that patience and time spent observing pollinators is just a part of the process for mastering your identification skills. Now, as I mentioned earlier, some bees can drill their own holes in the wood, like this large carpenter bee here, which is very large, the size of a grape. Many of you will probably have seen them flying around. Because of this habit of drilling hole in wood, they can sometimes become pests when they make their homes in our wooden structures. I've seen videos of wooden ladders infested with these guys. Those ladders are no good to climb on. This ability to drill holes in solid wood also makes them pests for some plants because they can use these strong jaws to chew holes in the long tubular bird pollinated flowers and just rob the nectar that they can't access by legitimate means, like this one here is doing. You can see it poking its tongue into the base of the flower petal where the nectar is being produced. Now, this again demonstrates the selfish nature of the relationship between pollinators and the plants they are supposedly servicing. Here's the Carpenter Bee Nest showing the cushy lives of the Carpenter Bee larvae. This photo was taken in Cochise, Arizona, and this is I think a yucca or agave stalk. So you can tell by the size of the larvae that the cells were made from left to right, with the oldest larva being on the leftmost side. You can also tell from this stalk that the bees have made these little dividers to separate the pollen balls from one larva to another. And these cell walls were actually made by gluing together the sawdust that the bee generated while excavating this tunnel in this stalk. So for all you DIY nerds out there, you can actually thank the Carpenter bee for inventing the first particle board. Here's a close relative of the large Carpenter bee, the aptly named small Carpenter bee. This again is a small, streamlined, sleek bee that's not very hairy, and it's very difficult to tell apart from a wasp unless you knew what you're looking at. But unlike the masked bee that I showed you earlier, this one does carry pollen using fuzzy pollen brushes on their hind legs. So when they're foraging, you can tell that these are bees. These bees don't quite have the jaw strength to drill holes in solid wood, but instead they excavate small stems for their nest. So one really cool fact about this bee that I just learned a couple of years ago is that they have this system where the mother bee will raise a dwarf eldest daughter as her first offspring, and then she makes this daughter forage for food for this daughter's younger siblings, so for the younger daughters of this mom. And this poor eldest daughter, works hard her whole life and generally doesn't get the chance to make her own nest and have her own offspring. So it's like a real life Cinderella story where the prince never shows up. But you don't have to get too sad for her, because research has shown that the work of this eldest daughter for her younger siblings is pretty much instrumental to her younger siblings' survival. So even though this Cinderella bee does not get to make her own children, she passes on her genetic information through her younger siblings, which will on average share 75% of DNA with her, due to this unique way that sex is determined in bees, where females have two sets of DNA, like you and me, one set from the father and one set from the mother, but males only have one set of DNA exclusively from the mother. And so a dad will provide identical copies of his entire genome to all of his offspring, whereas the mother will have genes that are mixed up, from each of her two parents. And then unfertilized eggs will all hatch into males, and fertilized eggs will all hatch into females. So in this bizarre world, boy bees will always have a mom, but no dad, but they'll also have a granddad. Okay, so quite funny to think about. In fact, this kind of elevated DNA sharing between siblings is one of the proposed reasons why many bees are social. Bees and wasps and ants, all of this kind of lineage share this trait of gender determination. So I mentioned earlier that social living is a relatively rare trait among bees, but still about 1 in 10 species do live social lives, and that's very, very high percentage when you consider the entire insect world. So these are groups where there's a single female queen that lays eggs, and then there are worker bees that take care of the babies and maintain the nest. Among this group, bumblebees are probably the most familiar. You can see that, like honeybees, they build these wax containers to store nectar, but unlike honeybees, it's a much more messy affair, right? Honeybees have these nice regular hexagons, whereas for bumblebees, they really just make whatever size containers work. Bumblebee colonies are also much smaller, usually with just a few dozen or hundreds of workers compared to tens of thousands for honeybees. And bumblebee colonies are also annual, which means that each year at the end of the season, only the newborn queens will survive through the winter after they've mated with males. And then they have to build everything from scratch again the following year. She has to raise her own offspring, unlike honeybee queens, which really just get fed and lay eggs. So you can see here that bumblebees are nesting in an artificial nest box. You can see the grate underneath that the breeders have put in. In the wild, most species nest underground in holes abandoned by rodents, but there are other species that nest in tree holes, bird nests, and clumps of grass. Now, the fact that bumblebee queens have to hibernate through the winter and then find a suitable nest site and then start her own colony by themselves really introduces a number of vulnerabilities into their life cycle, which includes exposure to pathogens and exposure to harsh climate conditions and limitations in nest sites. So many of the bumblebee species in the world are now thought to be threatened, including our very own Southern Plains bumblebee here in Oklahoma. And we're actually right now in the midst of writing a proposal to do a survey of all the bumblebees in Oklahoma to see how they're doing. Besides bumblebees, our only truly social native bees are all in the sweat bee family, like this little metallic sweat bee, Lacioglossom. And true to its name, this one is licking sweat off my finger. Some of our other metallic green sweat bees are also social, like this epauletted sweat bee, where researchers have found sisters sharing a nest where one sister serves as the queen and the other sister serves as her royal attendant. All right, on to the next fact. More than half the bees out there are not capable of stinging you. Now, one reason for that is that there's a bee tribe called the Melanoponini, the stingless bees, where 500 species or so all lack stingers. These only live in the tropics, so we don't really have any here in the US, except there's a tiny population in the California Bay Area that descended from research colonies sent from Brazil that then escaped the lab of this Stanford biologist and is spreading kind of through that area. But otherwise, there are no stingless bees native to the US. And these ones I photographed in Costa Rica when I visited that country. Actually, the other more important reason that so many bees cannot sting you is that half of the bees out there that you're going to encounter are males. And since stingers are just modified egg-laying organs and male bees don't lay eggs, none of the male bees can sting you. I should also mention, though, that even female bees of most species will not sting you unless you actively harass them or pinch them or try to pick them up. So you really don't have to be skittish around bees, especially while they're working. They just want to go about their day and collect their nectar and pollen. They don't really want to get in tussles with giant warm-blooded monsters like me and you. Okay, now this last fact here about not working hard and living an honest life, what's that about? How do bees make a living if they're not working hard, making nests and gathering pollen? Well, the answer is they invade the nests of a different bee species and then deposit their own eggs somewhere on or near the pollen provision. And then when their baby hatches, this robber bee baby eats the host's egg or larva and then takes over the pollen ball. Now, bees with this lifestyle are called kleptoparasites. And this lifestyle probably sounds familiar to you because it's what cuckoo birds do. So you won't be surprised to know that the common name for this group is cuckoo bees. The bee photograph here is the squash longhorn cuckoo bee, which parasitizes squash bees. So you can often see them flying around near pumpkin patches looking for nests of squash bees. Cuckoo bees come from a number of different lineages, at least across 3 different bee families. So they're kind of a widespread and diverse phenomenon. But despite their varied backgrounds, they all look kind of evil. I mean, doesn't this one just look like she's up to no good? This is another group that look a lot more like wasps than bees. So again, it'll take you some experience and some deeper research to really know and be able to identify this insect as a bee and not a wasp. Here's another bee, cuckoo bee, a tiny feral cuckoo. And you can see in this photo that despite being a lady, she does not have any pollen collecting hairs. No, so no hairy legs, no hairy bellies for the cuckoo bee ladies. So you might think that, this marauding nomadic lifestyle is pretty carefree and easy living, but that's not entirely correct either, because this kind of lifestyle really limits you to only living where your host bee is abundant. And also it's only a matter of time before you bump into the host of the nest and you get roughed up, like this mourning bee here that's being forcibly ejected from the premises by the digger bee host, who came back just in time to find this robber. Okay, so now I'm going to conclude this bee diversity portion of the talk because it'll take all day to show you all the amazing diversity of bees we have here. So hopefully this is just a nice sneak preview for you and you'll get the opportunity to enjoy our native bees yourself in the natural areas around you. Now, earlier I promised that I would talk a little bit about conservation. So that's what I'm going to talk about next. So as we know, organisms get wiped out when we degrade their habitat or destroy it. So the more acreage we can preserve and that we can maintain in high quality with respect to having lots and many different species of blooming plants, the better it is for our native bees. In many of the places I live, urban development and also large-scale row cropping are going to be the main threats to bee conservation. Here in Oklahoma, these two factors are a little bit less pressing, but we still do have the issue of encroachment of our native prairies by trees like eastern red cedar and Bradford pear. We also do have some management issues with deer over browsing the understory of forests where some of the most important plants for bees are growing. And we also do have some intensive hay cropping and pastures. So these are the kinds of threats that we should keep in mind when it comes to bee conservation in our state in particular. Another big threat to biodiversity at a worldwide level is climate change. Now, we've all heard about global warming, but that's just one aspect of global climate change. There are also other processes like extreme climate events that have been increasing as a result of climate change. And where I did my thesis in San Diego, one of the most harmful examples of this process is drought. So as you can guess, when everything is dry and crispy and there are no flowers blooming, bees will suffer as well. In our study, we found that bees are somewhat resilient and they do bounce back after a really poor series of drought years. But still, even 2 years after the drought, we still saw a 30% reduction in the number of bee species that were able to inhabit an area. So at least in the short term, there are strong impacts of drought on bees, but we don't have any good data on exactly what bees are doing during the drought itself. And we don't know what the long-term effects are of bee diversity after drought. So there's still a lot of room for study. And here in Oklahoma, this is also one of the more serious climate change threats because we are also kind of a drought-prone state. So whether I like it or not, this is something that I'm going to have to continue researching. But I think, this data that we have on hand from my thesis in San Diego really do tell us that climate change can be a threat that could be just as serious as losing habitat. So we really do need to keep an eye on this stressor to keep it from potentially getting worse. Another threat to our native bees, believe it or not, is honeybees. Now, researchers have estimated that a single honeybee colony could consume the same amount of pollen and nectar that could feed 30,000 solitary bees every single month, right? So that's close to 100,000 bees over the course of the peak blooming period. And that's in part because the turnover rate of honeybee workers is so high and because honeybees are kind of on the large side compared to our native pollinators. Here in Oklahoma, we have Africanized honeybees, which are good at kind of spreading around. But so far in my experience, they don't really seem to have built up to levels that are harmful the way they have in San Diego, where I did my dissertation. But that's something that I'm going to keep an eye on and probably continue to have a research program around. So I'll have more updates for you once I investigate the state a little bit more. So why should we care about the issues that our native bees are facing? Other than that, of course, preserving Earth's biodiversity is part of our heritage and it's the right thing to do. Well, for one, many plant species have special relationship with certain bees. So some lupines, which are some of the most beautiful spring flowers, they require large, beefy bees with enough mass to operate their petals in order for pollination to occur. So they really need these, large Bumble Bees and Carpenter Bees. There are flowers like nightshades and their relatives that need buzz pollination, where a bee will grab onto the anthers, and hit it with a sonic wave by vibrating its flight muscles so that the pollen grains can actually pour out of this little opening in the anther. We also have plants like forget-me-nots or Catantha that have tiny little flower openings where bees will require specialized hairs on their body to stick into these little wells to hook out the pollen in order to pollinate the plants. And then we also have plants that produce oils instead of nectar, so that only oil collecting bee species will pollinate these plants. So you have to have healthy bee communities that include all sorts of different bee species with different life cycles in order to maintain plant diversity at a large scale. Now, even if you're not one of these more specialized plants that require special kinds of bees to pollinate, it's still important for you to have a large diversity of bees around you. So for example, even generalist bees that theoretically could subsist on pollen from many different kinds of plant species, they could potentially have distinct preferences for the flowers that are all in bloom at the same time. And different bees may also prefer to pollinate under different environmental conditions, and they may have activity periods at different times of the year. So, and even if you have two generalist species that pollinate the same plant at the same time, they might pollinate different parts of the plant or even different parts of the same flower. Now, this all sounds kind of theoretical, as you can see, these line drawing diagrams, but these aren't just, concepts that could potentially happen. If you're a strawberry grower, you can actually see in your crop these misshapen strawberries that occur when you have small bees that pollinate the parts of the flower near the petal, but you're missing the large bees that crawl right over the entire flower that pollinates the tip of the strawberries. And in the natural world, pollinator declines, including declines in our native bees, will almost certainly lead to losing plant diversity. And perhaps in the worst case scenario, you can have landscapes that have lots and lots of beautiful wildflowers being taken over by things that are primarily clonal or wind pollinated, like grasses and fennels. Now, so for all these reasons, I think it's very important for us to get a good handle on our native bee biodiversity, know who's who, who lives where, and which species are being threatened in which part of their range, so that we can apply the best informed strategies and practices to protect them. So here's a rough map of how many bee species are known in some areas of the USA. Many of the states in our particular neighborhood have not been properly inventoried, so we don't really know exactly how many species there are in them. Oklahoma is one of these places. Right now, our confirmed list has about 300 species or so, and experts estimate that we may have like 700 or so species. So we still need to document and understand better about half of our bee biodiversity in our state. And that makes sense, that large number makes sense given how many different ecoregions we have. We have 12 level 3 ecoregions, which is tied with Texas, and only one ecoregion behind California, which is the #1 in the US. So, and we also have actually the largest number of ecoregions packed into a small area. So we really are a very important biogeographical crossroads. And as a result, we have lots of different species from different lineages that are being brought together, which is why, I think it's super exciting to be documenting bee diversity and conservation here. But like I mentioned earlier, there's been very little work so far in Oklahoma. And of the records that are available in biodiversity dataset repositories, almost half of the counties in Oklahoma so far have fewer than 10 available bee records. And actually many counties have no records whatsoever. So this is where you can come in and help. One thing you can do is to fill in the gaps of our knowledge on bee distributions by photographing bees and uploading them to this community science platform called iNaturalist. And you can help biologists keep track of bee populations in a way that we could never do before, because there are only a handful of biologists in any region that's specialized in monitoring bees. for the state of Oklahoma. So far, that's just me. We can't do this every day. We can't be everywhere at once. We can get permission to sample in wildlife management areas and state parks, but we can't get permission to sample in your ranch unless you personally give me permission to do so. And it's just, it's impossible for me to ask every landowner separately for permission. But every landowner can go out into their own property and take photos of these things and upload them to iNaturalist. And we mean bee biologists all over the world can look at them and extract useful information out of them, such as which bees are flying in what parts of the world, at what times of the year, and what plants are they foraging on. Now, to coordinate this effort better for the state of Oklahoma, I've set up the project Oklahoma Bee Atlas on iNaturalist, where if you submit data on submit records of bees on this site, they'll automatically be captured by this project and counted towards the number of species that are known from our state. And once I get all my ducks in a row settling here in Oklahoma, I'll be spending a bit of time every day identifying the bees that are uploaded there. So hopefully it'll be a system where if you see a bee, you upload it, you'll get a response pretty quickly about what the bee is. This is what the project currently looks like on a map. This is just a map that iNaturalist generates by itself, which is super helpful. And you can spend lots and lots of hours just poking around iNaturalist, looking at these patterns. As you can see, there are lots of people submitting bee photos in the OKC metro area, the Tulsa metro area, and some of the other kind of major cities around the state. But there really are still a lot of gaps to fill. So if you can, I'd be very grateful if you can install the iNaturalist app or sign up for an account on your computer and just start taking bee photos and uploading them. Another thing you can do to help is by restoring habitats, especially with native plants. Flowering plants in general are great, but really it's the native plants in an area that will be most helpful because the bees have co-evolved with these plants over the course of thousands of years. And these are the plants that will really help them feel at home and have healthy populations. Anything else you can do to promote healthy native plant populations will be great. So, removing invasive Johnson grasses and encroaching pears and cedars. If you can properly control your deer populations, if you mow and burn strategically so that you can maintain large populations of these forb and herbaceous species that need the disturbance, minimize the use of pesticides, whether it be plant pesticides or insect pesticides. These are all going to be good ways. And if you need some support on the front of restoring your habitat with native plants, you're at exactly the right place, because the Tribal Alliance for Pollinators is a global leader in this endeavor, and they have all sorts of great resources to help you in your restoration projects. So be sure to reach out to Jane and the team there here, and I'm sure they'd be very happy to support you. And lastly, be informed about what Save the Bees means. So as many of you may now guess after hearing my presentation, most of the time when people say save the bees, they really mean save our managed honeybees. Now, I'm not anti-honeybee. I think they're a great species. I have a lot of respect for them. I actually enjoy working with them. That's me in a bee suit as proof. But really, honeybees are not just taking the lion's share of food resources from the natural landscape, but they really have captured the public's attention. They have taken over the funding efforts and political clout, despite really being literally the least threatened bee species in the world. In fact, probably one of the least threatened species of anything in the world. So we really should aim to support not just the honeybees that are managed by beekeepers, which I think is our responsibility. I'm not saying we shouldn't support funding honeybee health projects and stuff, but if your goal is conservation of biodiversity, we really need to be targeting our native pollinators. So next time your friend asks you to help save the bees, you can ask them which bees, and then you can teach them all about native bees and the ways we can help. With that, I would like to thank the people and the entities and the funding agencies that have made my research and education efforts possible over the years. And I'd like to thank you for being here today. At this time, I'm happy to take any questions you may have. And please don't hesitate to contact me. I have my contact information below there. Happy to answer any questions via email anytime as well. All right.
Right. So thank you, Dr. Hung. I love that presentation, and I've thought about it a lot since I saw it the first time, and I learned a lot more this time. So thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Jane.
It's wonderful, and great photos, great information, just perfect. And from Zach, thank you for the wonderful presentation. If anybody has any specific questions for, okay, I don't know if you can see these as well, or I can just read them to you, Dr. Hung. From Priscilla, do you have any thoughts about creating nesting areas for native bees?
Ooh, that's a good one. Yeah, Jane, if you could read them to me, that'd be great.
Yeah,
So
okay.
I can stay on this presentation and direct to relevant slides as people need them. Yeah, creating nesting habitat. So as you saw, different bee species have different needs for nesting. So if you have a particular area that you're restoring with plants, which means you're providing food resources for the bees and you want to give them places to nest, it'd be helpful to have some bare dirt. And it's also helpful to let leaf debris piles accumulate in little clumps, because those are places where overwintering bees, like bumblebee queens, they will use those resources for overwintering. Also, if you have bramble or other plants that have pithy stems or hollow stems, if you can leave them lying around, those will be good for cavity nesting bees. If you have dead wood that are riddled with beetle holes, those are a favorite spot for a lot of the cavity nesting bee species. So providing a diversity of different kinds of natural debris and also bare ground, those will all be helpful things to do. And I'm actually thinking of starting a project where I import sand, just like dig shallow pits and just like put in smooth sand in some places and see if we can get sand nesting bees. So I'll report back once I try that out and see if that actually helps at all.
Okay.
Great question.
Okay, excellent. And next question, how can you track down wild honeybee colonies, and should they be destroyed?
Ooh, yeah, that's a tough one. So, honeybees are aliens in this country, but I consider them to be legal aliens because we brought them here in the first place. So, so I feel like unless it's proven that honeybees are causing a big issue, I don't think the colony should be destroyed. There are times when, of course, if they're in a utility box and your internet guy can't access it, you have to get someone to move that colony. There are ways to do so without killing the colony, and I know of businesses in San Diego. There might be some here in Oklahoma where they'll remove the colony and bring it to a bee yard or something like that. Tracking down wild colonies in nature, it's doable because honeybees have this amazing ability where they leave their nest and they're foraging and they can take any kind of random path. But once they finish foraging, they integrate all those paths, through these crazy trigonometric calculations in their brain. They beeline, right? We say beeline, like they literally fly straight to their colony in a straight line. So if you're sitting around watching honeybees forage and you see one has like completely laden itself with lots of pollen and it's flying straight in a direction, you can often follow it and find where the nest is. But the only successful honeybee eradication program that I know of was actually done by introducing a honeybee pathogen, I think on drones, the male honeybees onto an island population, and those drones that then mated with the queens, the young queens of these other hives that are on that island, brought the pathogen to them and killed all the colonies. So now Santa Cruz Island in California has no honeybees, even though it used to be overrun by them. That's really the only eradication effort I know of. And I suspect that any other effort on a mainland that will constantly have influxes of bees from beekeepers, from apiaries, even some backyard hobbyists, and also from neighboring states or whatever, I think that's going to be difficult. That's a great question. It's something that I've thought about a lot.
Okay, and this is question actually from Brandon. He said, he and Colin were asked the other day if supplying high fructose corn syrup could negatively affect the health of bees. Is there any validity to that?
I must say that I'm not sure about this topic. That's an animal husbandry question, and I think these are important questions, right? How do we, as good stewards and also as good agriculturists, keep our honeybee colonies as healthy as possible? And from what I know, honeybee colonies really sometimes just need that kind of carbohydrate, because we keep honeybees stocked at such high densities that they can't find enough nectar from natural sources, from wildflowers, to sustain their energetic needs for a colony to stay healthy, right? I mean, if you go to the wild where honeybees are native and abundant, you'll see, colonies every so often. You might see like 3 or 4 colonies on the same rock cliff, if you go to Asia, but you will never see like 85 colonies stacked one on top of the other. There's just no way to grow enough wildflowers to sustain that amount of honeybee density. So I think at the scale we're operating at, it'll be difficult to sustain the colonies that are under our management without this kind of supplemental feeding. Now, to what extent this is bad for them, as if they can subsist on wildflower honey, I don't know, but it seems that the more we can let their lives resemble what they would be like in nature, it's probably the better. But I really have not read into like the health problems that bees may have from eating this kind of diet. That's a great question too.
Okay, next question. Are bee hotels a good idea or a bad idea?
Oh, that's such a good one. Yeah, I have heard that. Okay, so first, there are certainly issues with bee hotels. So sometimes people make these cute little bee hotels with very shallow holes. And one thing that's really cool about bees is they can perfectly determine the gender of their offspring, right? Because again, fertilized eggs hatch into females and unfertilized eggs hatch into males. So for bee hotels, they're tunnels, right? And bees will always put boys on the outside because the strategy is the boys will emerge first. They find where all the flower patches are. They gorge themselves on nectar. They get lots of energy. And then when the females come out, the boys are ready to find them, pounce on them, mate with them and stuff before the females start making nests, right? You want to find a mate and have all the genetic information you need before you start nesting. So if your bee hotel tunnel is too shallow, the mother bee will actually just lay a bunch of boys. And then the sex ratio in your population can be skewed, where there's too many males and not enough females to build further nests. So that's one problem. Another problem is that in nature, oftentimes you don't get that high of a density of cavity nesting bees all together, right? You'll sometimes have one fallen log where there's a couple dozen beetle holes, but you won't find a situation where you have hundreds and hundreds of these reeds or nest blocks stacked in one place. So you can get disease and parasite buildups in those areas, and that could be a problem if your nest block or bee hotel is attracting a lot of bees from lots of different places, and then they're all getting hit by the same parasites instead of these bees scattering and finding the little corners where there's like one hole or two holes where they won't get attacked by parasites. But I think there's a lot more good research that could be done here to see to what extent can you stack these things on top of one another and still boost the population without having problems with pathogens and parasites. I think there's more research that needs to be done here. When people say, hey, should I put a bee hotel out in my yard? I usually say, yeah, sure, go ahead. Actually, one of my good friends is in the business of making these bee hotels. And I've told her very explicitly, like, look, I don't think you are necessarily going to be contributing to conservation of bees, right? It's only going to be a small percentage of bees that come and nest in these bee shelters in these people's yards. But if people have these bee hotels in their yards, they won't be spraying any pesticides on their own flowers because they want to see their bees succeed. They'll probably talk to neighbors and tell them not to use pesticides. So anything that can get you closer to nature probably is going to help in some intangible way. It's just for now, I don't think we have really enough data to know or to be able to say that putting out bee hotels is actually a legitimate conservation strategy.
Okay.
Yeah, more research needed.
Okay. Next question. There are a lot of native bee ID keys for the eastern and western states. Are there any quick ID keys for the documented species in Oklahoma or surrounding states?
That's such a great question. And the unfortunate answer is no, but that's why OU hired me. So hopefully that answer will change in 4 to 5 years.
Okay, very good. Next question. I'm trying to bring native bees into my native heavy community garden. Is there a benchmark native bee I should try to recruit intentionally?
That's another great question. So native bees are known to be present in urban areas to varying degrees. If you have a super urbanized area where there's just no flowers other than very isolated patches, you probably won't see too many. But it seems like in Oklahoma, we don't have that kind of high density, high intensity urbanization like we see in California, New York, and other kind of East Coast mega cities. So my suspicion is that there will be a lot of native bees still just floating around in the ether, because most places even in the OKC metro, we're not too far away from some sort of green space. In terms of native bees, you get different bee species in the spring versus in the summer versus in the fall. So I wouldn't say necessarily that there's like any particular native bee that you really want to be able to recruit. What I can say though is that it will be helpful both for conservation purposes and for the pollination of your vegetables of the garden, and also for enjoyment of people who are out there bee watching, is to have a succession of blooms that start in the early spring and then last through the fall, right? So this early spring plants, you can consider, if you can put in redbud trees, you can put in some early spring blooming herbaceous things like phacelias and so on. You have some plants for the summer, your coreopsis, your sunflowers, and then have stuff blooming into the fall like goldenrods and Symphyotrichum asters, and gumweeds, things like that. So if you have a steady progression of plants that go from the early spring all the way through the fall with no interruption, you're likelier to have some of these species that need a continuation of food resources, like our bumblebees, right? Because bumblebees, once the queens settle down, they need a non-stop flow of pollen and nectar in order to raise workers. And then ultimately at the end of the colony's life cycle, that's when they produce the new queens and the males that would mate with those new queens. So if your garden can have all these supplies, then hopefully what will happen is that you will have the spring bees that will settle down there. You have a different shift of summer bees and then fall bees, but then you'll also have these bumblebees that can settle nearby and forage from your garden year round.
Okay. We have a comment from Carol Clark. James, this has been a wonderful talk. So well done. Recent projects from Texas to identify all Texas specimens held in collections are now putting our identified Texas native bee species around 1,200, with estimates that an additional 10% remain undiscovered.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that information. That's good to know.
And yeah, so I think we're running lots of positive feedback. Everybody loved this talk. So thank you so much. And this was great. And we appreciate you sharing your vast knowledge of native bees with us. And here at Tribal Alliance for Pollinators, obviously we're all about the pollinators. So so just thank you. And if people have any follow-up questions or whatever, please don't hesitate to get in touch with us. And with that, stay warm, everybody. And thank you for attending.
Thank you. And Jane, please don't hesitate to pass out my contact information. If anyone reaches out to you and say, hey, how can I get in touch with James? Please pass on my information to them.
Okay. Okay, well, thank you. It's very generous of you. I know you've got a busy schedule. Also, we will be posting this on our website. There was a recording done of this presentation, and we'll be posting it to the website. If you want to share it with people, please do. This is great information, and we'd like more people to get this information. So, oh, and I just see one note. Thank you, James. I streamed this for my science classes at my middle school. So
Wonderful. Thank you, Amanda.
very cool. So, all right. Well, thank you with that. We will sign off for today, but we'll be having more webinars soon, and please stay in touch. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Take care.